awesome. Yes, last talk of the last day. This is the hardest part of the conference to be in. So thank you very much for those of you who are here. My name's Andrew Barron. I'm the design director at Bohemia Interactive Simulations. I'm also a product development lead on our main product, Virtual Battlespace 3. My talk is about how to scale to 250 developers. So maybe that's a bit beyond where some of you are at now, but hopefully you'll all get there. So is anyone here working with a team that's more than a dozen people? One, excellent, okay, a couple. All right, so this will be interesting. This is a talk about management. Does anyone here like management? There's one, two, okay. Does anyone here want to work or have your project eventually have more than 50 people working on it, let's say? Okay, a couple, good. So if you want to get there, you have to have management. So it's boring, but it's necessary. So that's kind of what my talk is about, it's about management, it's about how to scale, and it's about how not to have everything fall apart just because you're successful. I'll try to go quickly through it, and then I'll leave time for questions at the end, because I'm not sure which of this will be relevant to all of you. But I'll try to show you essentially what works at our scale. And that way, hopefully, as you start having your success and you start scaling up, you can have something in mind of one model for scaling. So first of all, how do I, well, can I get some help on this clicker? Well, anyway, so first of all, does anyone know Bohemia Interactive? We're based in Prague. We make games, Arma 3, DayZ. So, yeah? Okay, cool, now it works. Thank you. So I work for Bohemia Interactive Simulations. I'm American, but I do also live and work in Prague. We're actually a separate company. We're a sister company of Bohemia Interactive. We take the game engine behind Arma and DayZ, and we turn it into real-life military simulators that are used to train soldiers around the world. So it's a slightly different industry, but it's basically the same type of work. It's still, we're working in a game engine. And we're at about 250 people worldwide in multiple offices around the world. And when I first started with the company, back in 2006, it was just one team of us in a shed in Australia. So I've really seen it change from single indie team. We were basically a bunch of modders taking a Operation Flashpoint at the time and modding it into a military simulator. And now we've grown up to this size of a company. And we've had a lot of struggles along the way. But we didn't fall apart yet. So here's an example of what can go wrong, though, when you're scaling. So does anyone know Telltale Games here? Does anyone know they just went out of business last month? Yes, exactly. So this is a really good article about what was going on in Telltale Games in kind of their last months. So they were at about 300 people by the end of it. They started out as a small team. They scaled up to 300 people because they were getting successful. They started having a number of projects because they were trying to replicate their success over and over, and they were having a lot of difficulty managing all their projects, all their releases. So suddenly what was working for them as a small team, when they tried to multiply up to 300 people, they were having a lot of difficulty managing it. And the theme that you hear in this article is, hey, everything was always on fire. Everything's on fire all the time. And if any of you worked in a larger studio, that actually happens a lot. We had that a lot. Everything was on fire all the time. When you have so many people and so many projects and so many features that you're working on, if it's not well managed, everything's on fire. And hey, the developers in this article, they're saying, look, it seems like nobody's looking out for the long term. Why is everything always on fire? Well, it's because the managers aren't looking out for the long term. They're just firefighting. And in the end, this led to burnout and drain on their best employees, so they all left. And this is kind of a similar situation that we started facing about 5 years ago. We were, in 2013, we were at about 120 developers. This is a little chart of our growth. So we were fairly successful at that time, mid-sized success, 120 of us, and we were still growing. We were growing by about 30% a year, but we were losing 15% of our staff every year, and it got even worse. And this is because we had constant crunch. We were doing 4 releases per year. Every single release, we had everyone working overtime every 3 months. And it's the most important thing we do is release product. It's the most predictable thing we do is release product. And we were somehow messing it up every release. Our projects were running 200% over budget. So we just had no idea how much our stuff was going to cost, and we couldn't predict when we were going to start or end on things. This is sort of the chaos that we found ourselves in. And at that point, as a leadership team, a management team, we really started looking to see what we could do differently. So we started trying a whole bunch of other things. Some of them were successful, some of them were failures. But by the end of it, by today, we're down to a 3% turnover rate. We don't have any crunch anymore. We've eliminated that. We have better quality than we've ever had. We have less bugs than ever. And we're on budget and we're predictable with our projects. And we're still growing, as you can see. So the thing, though, is none of us were management experts. So to get from one side to the other, we had to do a lot of study and a lot of learning outside of our own disciplines. I come from design. I'm not a manager. None of us really had a lot of experience outside of this company. A lot of us had been with the company since it was just a team in a shed. So it was a big mind shift for us to figure out how to change from what we were doing to what we needed to do. And this is kind of the mind shift that's needed. You need to stop thinking about just building a product. That's once you finally reach a certain amount of success, you've got that handled. Instead, you need to work on building a system that builds products. So building the company, building the organization itself. That's the product that you as leaders and as managers, that's the thing that you now have to focus your efforts on. And that's a very different skill set than it takes just to build a product. You have to go from designers and programmers to managers, to leaders. And so one way to envision this system, this is just a sort of theoretical way to look at any organization. You have this system, this product development system. You have ideas and money that come into it on the left. You have resources, that's the corporate term for people who work on that idea and they get paid that money. And then they make projects. They work in the form of a project, which makes a product, which then ships out the door and makes money that can feed the system again. And then overall, you have this set of leaders and set of like processes or principles that are used to guide the system as a whole. And this is really simplistic, but it is a system. And the same things that apply to a system of building automobiles can also apply to a system of building video games or any software. And if you want to read more about systems and product development as a system, these are two really good books that I highly recommend. And one of the main takeaways that I learned from this, coming from a culture where everything's always on fire and everyone's busy all the time, one thing you learn when you take a step back and look at a system as a whole is that sometimes what you're doing actually doesn't matter. So you think that just because you're working hard, it matters, but it doesn't, because the system as a whole the only thing that matters is the final output of that whole system. So just because you're over in one corner working really hard on QA or programming or design or anything, it doesn't matter. What matters is the final output of that system as a whole. And if your leaders aren't thinking in big terms like that, then you're going to always be firefighting and everyone's going to be so busy all the time, and you might fall apart like Telltale. Thing though is that the complexity of this system increases exponentially as you grow, and hopefully you will all grow this big, but you'll avoid the mistakes that we made. So we started out, like I said, a small team in a shed working on one product. This is pretty much where all indie game devs start out, right? Once we finally made some success, we have some money, we start making DLCs, or rather our version of DLCs. And we grow the team slightly. And this goes on for another couple years. It's pretty simple still at this point. But then we start getting more and more people, and suddenly we can't all fit in a single shed. And so we start dividing into departments. We have programming department and designers and QA. And we're working on many projects at the same time. And they have different ship dates. And it starts getting a lot more complex. But because we only have one product that all this is for, it's still limited complexity. Once you start branching into multiple products and multiple physical offices, now things just explode exponentially. And this is basically where we got to about 5 years ago. So we had multiple products. We had really deep silos of maybe like 30 programmers all in one team. We had different offices that also had silos in them. And we had this mess of projects all working on different things at the same time. And this is where you don't want to get to, and this is where we were at, and we had to climb our way out of it. So I will sort of show you how we did that. But briefly, at this size, it's very important that what you're doing with this system is you're balancing order and chaos in this system. So I mention this because it sounds very boring to talk about process. It sounds very corporate. I was very much afraid of working in a big, boring corporate environment. But the thing is, you don't want to, and you don't have to. You don't want to become rigid and bureaucratic, but you need a balance of both in order to scale. So chaos, what I mean by that is if you have too much chaos, things are unpredictable, you have low quality work, you never finish anything, you're always firefighting, but just the right chaos, just the right amount gives you creativity and innovation, and it's a great work environment. Order, the right amount of order is great because you have some predictability in your process, you have some steady output, you have high quality output, and your people get to go home on time, they're not crunching all the time. That's the sort of the main evil in the games industry is just too much chaos, and everyone's working way too many hours because they love their job and they think that they should work so many hours. But you don't want that. You want the right amount of order. But you don't want too much order because then you have no creativity, you have a bureaucracy, and companies just end up falling apart because they just try to do the same thing over and over again and they get stagnate. So this is how we look today, and this is, in my opinion, a balance between order and chaos. So I'll walk through this briefly, but this is kind of our org structure, how we're set up. So we're now organized, instead of by departments, we're organized by product that we work on. And each product has a lead, and then there's teams underneath that lead. And we have a number of products that are all kind of similar structures, different sizes. My product is there on the left, VBS3. And then we have this sort of central pool of central resources that are shared across all the products, rather. And work is fairly simple at this point. It just flows down nice and simple. It's not a chaotic mess of just blue arrows going everywhere like I showed you earlier. So I'm going to very quickly walk you through how this works. Let's start at the bottom. So these teams. What are these teams? So these are our basic building block of our org structure. And these are small teams. They are small cross-functional teams. As you can see, they have a team lead, they have programmers, they have designers, and they have testers in the team. And this is, if you're on your first project, this is where you start. And the problem is, as you grow, what I showed earlier is that people tend to, instead of maintaining this power of this team, they try to divide up according to discipline. Programmers all together, designers all together, QA all together. And I'm telling you, that's a mistake, and that's probably the main lesson that I would hope you learn from this at your size, is that if you do reach success, the thing that made you successful was that small team of different people of different disciplines. So don't break that up. Just multiply it using multiple teams. So in the end, you have these stable teams that are agile and they're highly independent, rather. And so I guess if none of you are in a very large company, then you kind of don't know the opposite of this. But like I said, I do believe that the small team gives you the highest human performance. This is how humans are meant to work. We're meant to be like small bands of hunter-gatherers and working together with different skill sets. In the end, you'll hear the argument that, well, it's more efficient to have all the programmers together because specialization leads to efficiency. That's wrong. There's a lot of literature in the Agile or Scrum software development body of knowledge, I guess, that really disproves this. Because what you end up with is a lot of waste. If you have all your programmers together, they're going to write features that are never going to ship because they're too buggy to ship. And by the time they find the bugs, it's too late to fix them. So these are examples that we used to run into all the time, where people were doing a lot of hard work and their work never made it into the hands of the users. So what was the point of all of that? But if you have a smaller team of all the disciplines together, you only do the work that's necessary to get the thing out the door, and you don't have time to waste on other stuff. This also scales really well. So let me show you the opposite of a small team. So when we were in our deep functional silos, this is what our workflow looked like in Jira. This is just grew and grew and grew every year. It was basically bureaucracy. We tried to manage through bureaucracy because we had to hand off between all of these teams of people on different floors and people that weren't just working together in the same room. And so it just grew and grew and grew. And now this is what it looks like. It's much simpler. Now each team has their own workflow. It's very small. The teams actually can customize the workflow to themselves because they're not handing stuff between each of the teams. And a great book if you want to see more about the power of teams, of real teams. I recommend this book. And this was written in the 90s, and it wasn't about software development, so it kind of is before Scrum and Agile became really a popular thing. But the same principles that make Scrum powerful is documented in this book. So I highly recommend this one as well. So the team leads. Let's talk about these team leads. So we have these teams that are cross-functional. They have programmers and designers and QA in them. So who do you have lead a team like that? Do you have a programmer lead it? Do you find the best programmer and make them lead it? Do you have a designer? How do you choose? So my argument is your team leads need to be people leads, not technical leads. So this is the biggest factor in your success of scaling is not about the process that you choose. That's why my talk isn't about process, it's about people. So you need to make sure that the right people are your leaders. And this is why I mentioned people leaders. So the question though is, how can you have a programmer, or why wouldn't you just take your strongest programmer and make them leader of all the programmers? And I kind of call this the Conan the Barbarian model of leadership, which is why I have him down there. So it's like saying, you know, Conan, he was really strong, he had big muscles, and he could chop people's heads off with swords, so we should make him our king. You know, and that's kind of what you see with when you start growing. You find the strongest programmer who can write the best code, and you make him your king of programmers. But the problem is, it's a totally different job. Leading programmers, leading anybody is different than being by yourself and writing code. So the model that I really like of leadership is this idea that the leader's job is not to lead everything. The leader's job is to make sure everything is being led. So the leader doesn't have to be the best programmer. The leader just has to be able to identify the best programmer and say, we're following that guy right now for these, you know, for this programming architecture decision. The leader just has to identify, hey, nobody's looking out for the long term. Either I'm going to look out for it, or I'm going to find somebody on my team who's really thinking about this and have him maybe make a schedule for us. And so the basic tasks that an actual leader or a manager, as we call them in a company, the main things that they should be doing when they're not, or instead of writing code, let's say, is these. And management is a very well documented science, I guess, or discipline, so I'm not going to go into these, but these are just as important in a game company as anywhere else. So the first thing the leader does is grows the people. The main practice for this is called one-on-ones. You just meet with your people every week for half an hour each in private. It's the best manager tool that exists. I recommend it. The next thing that the lead does is grows the team as a whole. So holding team meetings, Scrum has a lot of great meetings in it, holding stand-ups, things like this. So making sure the team works together as a team and reaches that maximum human potential. That's the leader's, the manager's job. And then of course a manager delegates work, monitors the progress. Business communication, as the business gets bigger, this is incredibly important, and usually it's the manager that should do it because you don't want your programmer doing business communication. This is just letting everyone else know what's going on. Quite honestly, the bigger the organization gets, the more time you spend just talking with people in the organization. And it seems inefficient, but if you don't do that, it's total chaos and nobody knows what's going on and everything falls apart. And so you got to think long-term as a leader. Hiring and firing, also, by the way, the most important thing that a manager does. This determines who joins your organization, so it determines your organization. So this could be a whole talk by itself. Hiring is incredibly important. So rather than put time into your development process, if you're growing, you should probably put time into your hiring process. This is what you shouldn't do if you're a leader on one of these teams. You shouldn't be doing something yourself if you can just delegate it to someone else. And the reason for that is because you're wasting company money at that point. And this was a very hard lesson for me to learn when I first took over as a lead designer. I wanted to go and do design tasks because I was really good at it. That's what made me the lead. I was the strongest designer on the team. But at one point, our chief operating officer said, why? Why are you doing that? You're being paid more than all these other designers, and you're paid because you're supposed to be managing. So if you're doing something that they can do, then you're wasting company money, because why are we paying you so much to do that? And who then is doing the management? So you literally are wasting money if you're not managing as a manager. So don't do it. Firefighting, if you're finding yourself firefighting, it's poor management. So anytime you're in a company and if everything's on fire all the time, poor management. And if you're a manager, then you're part of the problem. Don't be negative and disagree with everyone. This is something that so personalities start becoming also a bigger problem the bigger the company gets. And if you have maybe a really senior programmer who's been there since the beginning and he's kind of an asshole or something, then it basically just drags everything down. So don't do that. Yeah, action's better than inaction. So sometimes just disagree with someone, but then just let it go. Just move on. If that decision isn't going to kill the project, then sometimes it's better just to say, look, I don't agree with that decision, but we're going to go with it, and then you commit and you go with them. Yeah, I will very briefly mention this. So there's other approaches out there to management, like Scrum or matrix organizations, or using producers, depending on how you use it. These are all kind of like different than a traditional management structure, but in the end, just make sure that you have one clearly designated person it's their job to be responsible for everything in the end. Because if you don't have that, then you got a bunch of people that are saying it's not my job, and nobody's responsible for the final outcome. Here's an example of how the Navy does it. So we're actually trying to hopefully build them a simulator. But this was not too long ago. A U.S. Navy ship crashed into some civilian tanker in the ocean. 10 people died. The captain was the one held responsible. Some other people as well, but the guy in charge of the whole ship. So ultimately, it was probably the guy doing the navigation that screwed up, but the captain was the one who takes the blame, because he should have trained that guy better. He should have put a better guy in charge of navigating. That's ultimate responsibility. Here are two really good books about management and leadership, so I recommend these as well, and pretty much everything I said came from these. All right, so I talked about the teams, I talked about the team leads. Let's talk about this staff. So there's this concept that comes from the military, actually, originally, this idea between there's line roles and there's staff roles. And this is a really useful tool when you scale beyond a couple teams. So what do you do with those really senior technical guys that you don't want to have managing other people? You put them in the staff. That's usually the best solution. So the idea is a line role is something that works directly on the product. They're responsible for shipping features or shipping whatever the product is. The staff's job is to help in an advisement position, to help the product lead and the team leads. But they aren't directly managing anyone. They're not directly responsible for anything. And this is, like I said, a great place that you can leverage your senior contributors. This is where my lead programmer, lead designer, they're on the staff. They help me and they help the teams, but they're not directly leading any of those teams. So yeah, I mentioned line, staff, and it's important to note that there'll always be tension. So your lead programmer is going to want the programmers on every team to do perfect architecture and perfect coding, but the team lead wants to ship product. He wants to get things out the door because he's got deadlines to meet. So there's tension between the two. He doesn't have time for his programmers to make everything perfect. But that's why the staff is not a leadership role, it's an advisory role. All right, here we go. So last, the product lead, not last, second to last. Yeah, so this is where I sit. You'll see I'm not the top manager, but I'm not the bottom manager. So I'm the middle manager, which is like the butt of all jokes in Dilbert. It's like the pointy-haired boss, right? But middle management is actually extremely important and extremely necessary once you reach a certain size. The same basic management tasks still apply for a middle manager. You're still managing people, but you're managing managers. That's the distinction there. And it's difficult because those managers also have teams that they're managing, so you're not really a team in the same way that your managers are part of a team. So yeah, I won't get too much into this, but here's the important thing. The most important thing that a middle manager can do is actually check up on the work from those team leads to make sure that they're held accountable. You don't just ask someone, hey, is that project on track? And they go, yeah, it's on track. Cool, everything's on track. No, you ask them, why is it on track? What evidence do you have that this thing is on track, that this project is on track? And you don't do that because of lack of trust. You do that because you want to know how they arrived at that answer. So this is a great phrase that I read somewhere is, as a manager, you don't get what you expect, you get what you inspect. And this is probably the best guiding principle, I think, as a middle manager you can use. If it's really important, if it's important enough for you to expect it, then you should be checking it. You should be inspecting it. I will skip through this, but this is essentially what I do. So 10% of my job, I'm just inspecting the work of my teams. And we do it in the form of a sprint review meeting every 2 weeks. It's like half a day, so it's an hour per team times however many teams we have, 4 teams, let's say. And it's basically the team and the lead presenting to myself and my staff and the other team leads, and we spend half an hour and they show what work they did on the product. We poke holes in it, we talk about it, and then we spend half an hour talking about the project progress itself. So how many requirements have you completed? What's your burn up look like, or your burn down look like on your budget? Are you on track on budget? So we basically dig into all these details, and we generate a whole bunch of actions out of it every meeting. And that's how you know it's a productive review, because you need to have a bunch of actions. Otherwise, you're just talking. And again, at this scale, if you're just talking, then you're just wasting your time. And then I have a separate review with my boss where we go at an even higher level through all the same stuff. All right, so let's talk about my boss. As at the top level of management, it's still a team effort. You don't just have your head of development sitting in an office by himself and just making a bunch of plans or who knows what. It's a team effort, and this team has to have a plan. If there's no plan, then there's chaos at the lower levels, and that's what you saw earlier at Telltale, and that's what we saw. But at the same time, if the plan is too detailed, then you don't actually have any control. You think you have control at the top, but you don't, because you're fooling yourselves by thinking you can plan to that level. You can't. So you need to rely on your lower level managers, your lower level leaders, to really help you to build the plan and to execute the plan. Also, at this point, you have to involve the other business functions. So at this size, not only do you have silos of programmers and designers, you're also going to have a marketing department and a finance department and many other sort of non-development functions within the company. And they don't talk to each other usually, but they need to at the top, at least. It's very important. So, for example, the CEO sets the strategy. The CEO must be discussing with the head of development. Sales and marketing, it's very important that development needs to work closely with sales, because that's what pays developers. You build the product and then someone has to buy it. So you got to help each other out. Finance is important as well. We didn't really, this is a talk about development, but at Telltale, you can guarantee you the reason they went out of business was because of finance, because they ran out of money. And so if you're hiring too many people and you're not forecasting how much sales you're going to get, you're going to run out of business. So it's a team effort across a lot of different disciplines here. And so the way that we do this, we do a quarterly meeting where we have the middle managers and above in development, and we have all these other business functions, and we get together and we forecast our sales demand, and we check how many people we have, and then we compare the two to each other, and then we take corrective action. So this is what we do to try to not go out of business, basically, or to try to avoid having to lay everybody off. We try to estimate how much money is going to come into the business, and we try to make sure we're not hiring more people than that money can support. So it's super boring, but as a manager, you're responsible for the money that's paying for people's families, so you got to take this stuff very seriously. This is an example of how we do the resourcing. I won't go into this, but we just use spreadsheets, and then we generate a production schedule that shows what we're going to be working on. And we're running 80 projects or more per year, so it's a lot of stuff, and this is 150 developers. And so you have to segment the complexity like that. Okay, so I'll wrap up, and then I have time for questions for whatever part is relevant you think. So to summarize the key lessons that we learned from scaling, number one, the product isn't the product anymore, it's the organizations that's the product. So you build that organization, and you got to balance chaos and order in it. Don't try to go too far to one way or the other. Use small cross-functional teams as your basic building block. That's how you started. I guarantee that's how you started as a company. Don't get away from that. Don't make the mistake of thinking that you'll be more efficient by dividing into programmers and artists separately, or programmers and designers. Keep the small team together. If they can't fit in a room together and talk to each other, then don't Don't try to go beyond that. And the people that should be leading are people managers, not technical managers. So don't think that just because someone's a strong programmer or a strong designer, they're going to be good at leading people, because it's generally not true. And then if you do have those strong programmers and designers, put them in staff positions if you want to keep them leveraged across your organization. If you're in middle management, if you've grown big enough to have it, make sure you inspect what's going on. Don't just expect results, inspect for results. And then finally at the top, top management is a team effort, just like a small team. Okay, so I'll end it there. Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you. Questions, anybody? In the back? No, over here. Okay. You can also just shout it out. It's not that big of a room.
Hey, thank you. This was brilliant. Very totally worth staying until the end of the
thank you.
of the conferences. And really, I want to insist that you managed to make a business, slash management topic, both very clear and human. Like you keep talking about people's families, etc.
Thank you.
What would you recommend to small indie studios that start, because all of those points are excellent, but of course in the beginning some of them are overkill. And I take away from your talk that the basic building block is the cross-functional team, but any other advice on how to scale rationally? Right,
so the question is about scaling before you get to 250. So my talk was about sort of mid-size. But as an indie studio, you're probably, the problem you'll face is going from one team of 10 or less and going to maybe 30. That's really a big leap right there. And so my advice on that, the reason that I think this is still relevant is because you hope to get to this size one day, probably. And so keep it in mind that don't go down the wrong path. So I would say don't break into departments. Don't break into deep silos of the programmers. So avoid that. Avoid the silos. Avoid the technical manager. Avoid that. Your managers, your leaders need to be like generalists and people leaders. And they need to think about the business. They need to be basically entrepreneurs. And so if you have somebody and he's your best programmer or whatever, and as you start growing, don't just put him as the lead just because he's got the most skill and experience. Or what you have to do, if you're the lead, if you're the CEO, you need to be coaching that guy. So that strong designer, you need to coach him to become a strong people leader. And these things, I mean, our biggest bottleneck right now is we don't have enough leaders, I would say. And that's such a painful situation to be in. And it's totally, my fault, for example, because it takes years to grow people into that role. So I would say, grow leaders, grow people leaders is the other thing, because they're just a super valuable commodity, and they're so hard to hire. Other questions? Did that answer your question? We can talk afterwards as well.
I saw a screenshot about Google Spreadsheets.
Yes.
Do you, as a big company, have to use, or are you using some specialized software for management, or it's just good old spreadsheets?
So the question is about, do we use any tools? When you say management, are you talking about like resource management or portfolio management? What sort of management? For communicating with other people. Yeah, meetings are, in my opinion, the best way to do that. Face-to-face communication is the best. Well-structured meetings is the best way. Otherwise, I mean, we use Jira, we use Confluence, but the thing is, if you over-rely on these tools, we had cases where we had a, so there was one task on one project that was taking weeks to complete. And it was the programmer would write some code, he would send it over in Jira, he'd write a big long comment in Jira, send it over to the QA, QA would test it and go, hey, this is broken. And then it went back and forth between them, because it would be a day or two before the tester would pick it up, a day or two before the programmer would pick it up. And then the tester would go, hey, there's no testing guidelines, I don't know how to test this, right? So this went on like for weeks on the simplest thing. And so at the time, the project manager just went and said, okay, come here, programmer. And he walked them upstairs to the floor where the QA was. And he had them sit and talk to each other. And they resolved it like that, using face-to-face communication. And those guys had been working with the company for years, and they'd never, ever had a face-to-face conversation. So don't rely on tools. Business is still a human-like sport, no matter how big you get. So don't get away from that. As far as like the other tools, though, like at some scale, you do need things written down, obviously. And again, it's really not about the tooling. It's about the people using the tools. So you need to be very diligent as the user. And then it kind of doesn't matter. Because, I mean, tools is a whole other topic. Don't use a tool until you can do the manual version of that. Because the tool doesn't solve your problem. So anyway, that's why we're still using spreadsheets. Because it works, and we actually haven't found a better tool for that specific thing. Other questions? You can just speak. I'll repeat your question. Yeah.
But
Thank you.
I wanted everyone to hear.
Okay.
Thank you for presentation, and partly you answered my question that guy someone asked, but again, when you grow your team, even if you have functional teams, at what point you understand that you need like additional leader, additional like someone helping from staff, or some maybe marketing guy already, you know, or let's say if you do sales, at what point you understand that it's not just one person in sales, you need something more, and so on. So these steps, like when you grow the company, are there some, you know, are the indicators, exactly when do you know, today or in a week I will need one more guy there?
Okay. So the question is, when do you know that you need more people in a given discipline or function? It's a good question. It's probably beyond the scope of my talk, so I don't have a strong answer for that, but I'd say that in my experience, everything starts off as an additional duty. So you have, like maybe you don't have a marketing department, but you have one guy who handles most of the marketing, or maybe the previous talk, outsourcing. Maybe you're doing a little bit of outsourcing, and so you find somebody who handles it for you. But it's in addition to his other job of being a programmer or a producer or whatever else he does. But at some point, that additional duty, that one extra thing, will take up so much more of his time that he can't do the rest of his job. So I'd say once it reaches beyond maybe 50% of what he does, then you should probably consider getting someone to do that full time. But it's also a business thing, because you need money to pay these guys. So. So how do you check this? How do you measure this? Well, I'd say at the team level, if you use Scrum, Scrum does retrospectives. So during the retro, you talk as a team, and you talk about what are your bottlenecks, what's preventing you from performing better as a team. And then you'll identify things like this. And then the Scrum Master or the team lead then should take it outside the organization. Or I'm sorry, outside the team to look for solutions. So within the team, that's one way to do it. If you're already at the scale where you have multiple teams, then I would say you it's a similar process, but just at the next level up. So if you we're monitoring. Let's see. So yeah. Can you explain the question a little bit more? Then I'm not sure.
Okay, so for example, we have a team, and that's very good answer for the Scrum team. So for small functional team, it's okay. But when you grow, you are a middle manager, and how those like requirements, I understand that they go from Scrum team, but let's say when you plan for long term, you need something that will tell you that in like 5 months or 2 weeks, you will need another team or another guy or someone to take some, like you say, duties or something extra, because you need to plan. It's not like planning like at this size already is already not just like your sprint, which will go like a week or two, but you are planning like quarter, a year, something like that.
Right. So how do you do planning or forecasting where you have middle managers and beyond. So that's what I briefly touched on. We have a quarterly meeting where we do that. So we typically, a large source of our revenue is from development contracts. So some military will pay us to add features into the product. So we basically are tracking all of these bids that we've made on all these contracts, and then we have some probability that we think we're going to win them, and we know how much work it'll be if we win that contract because we did an estimate on it originally. So we have essentially all these estimates for all the stuff that we might do, and then we kind of merge it all together and come up with, well, we think that it's most likely that we'll have this much demand. If you're run more internally from like research and development, so well, then I guess you only have so much money, so I guess it depends on how much money you've got to burn. Otherwise, you can still use estimation techniques. So you estimate as much as you can the work going forward and start forecasting that way. I guess one last thing, if you're that middle manager and you're doing a lot of stuff yourself because you don't want to delegate it to the teams because it kind of doesn't make sense or they wouldn't be able to handle it. So let's say there's some marketing functions and you don't feel you can trust your team with it because maybe they don't have the big enough picture, or maybe there's some like bigger picture design or some big architectural things and you're doing it yourself because you don't feel the team can do it. That's also a good sign that you probably need someone on staff to help you with those things. So I had this with sales estimates. We do 1 or 2 sales estimates per week. We're shipping them out constantly, and it was taking so much of my time. As soon as I put a designer doing that for me, you know, I had so much more time, and that's half of his job is just those sales estimates now. Question over here? Oh. I'm happy to talk to anyone afterwards, by the way, after this. We still have time because I'm the last speaker, so thank you.
So I have a question about the manager, yes. And do I understand this right, that you think that it's better to have a leader from the inside of the company, from the team, than just hire from outside somewhere?
I used to think that. I don't think that anymore. So the question is whether leaders should come from within the team or hire from the outside. And I used to be really opposed to the idea of hiring from the outside, but and really up until recently, up until a year or so ago. But I have 2 very good leaders that we hired from the outside and that had never worked in games before. And they are extremely effective in our environment. So I would say that both can work. But the difficulty, it's the same if you're hiring from the outside or if you're promoting from within. Identifying what makes a good leader and who should be promoted to that is actually very, very difficult. And for me, my success rate on that is, I mean, I'd say half the people that I put into leadership positions I had to let go or move somewhere else because it wasn't working. And that's either from hiring from the outside or promoting from within. So both can work.
Thanks.
Do you have other follow-on to that?
Well, no, I don't think no.
Okay, thank you. Cool. Anything else? Cool. All right. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time. And have a good